Hello and welcome back to Science of Medicine. As we continue our discussion of the nervous system, I'm now going to draw my attention to the peripheral nervous system. So we've spoken about the central nervous system comprised of the brain and spinal cord, and now we're going to look at the periphery. The peripheral nervous system is made up, if you remember, of three parts. I have a sensory or somatic, a motor, and then what was called my autonomic or automatic nervous system. And we'll talk about all three of these. Now, on the sensory side, I have lots of different sensory inputs. And these sensors are located in different locations. For example, in the skin, I have sensors for pressure, touch, temperature, and those will all send nerves back to the spinal cord. Now, some of them will synapse in a ganglion with another neuron and will then go backwards to the spinal cord and come in through a nerve root, and then that information will be transmitted up the spinal cord, remembering that I will, on the somatic or the sensory side, cross at the spinal cord within a few levels and then go to the contralateral or opposite side. And this is clinically exceptionally useful. We can map out where these different nerve root sensors come from. And we call that map a dermatome. This is where the different nerves are actually going back for their root. And what I want you to notice in this picture is the following. First off, it makes sense because the upper portions of your body are from the upper portions of the spinal cord, the middle from the middle, and the lower for the lower. There are a few things that may look like they don't follow that, and I'll try to explain them in a few minutes. So first off, if I look at the cervical is for the most part my head and my arms. And when I actually look at the top one, that's going to be the top one that's going to go from the top of my head and moving down. Now, the distribution on the middle portion of my body is going to be on the thoracic. And then on the lower part, on my legs, is going to be my lumbar. I have some areas where my sacral roots are actually present. Those are generally in my genitalia and down my posterior portions of my leg. This is extremely useful, and it's not that physicians memorize this kind of chart. What we do is we have general principles that guide us. For example, I know that certain markers will give me an indication of where things are. If I look at C7, cervical 7, that's going to actually be my middle finger. All right, that's an easy one to remember. If I look at where my nipples are located right at T4. If I look at my umbilical cord area, my umbilicus, where my belly button is, that's T10. My genital area is going to be in my sacrum, and then my lumbar region is going to go down to the legs, with the frontal portion being the higher levels of that and the lower portions on the front being the lower portions, going from L1 through L5. Knowing that information helps you differentiate because everybody's different, so where exactly T4 versus T5 versus T6 would be is going to vary slightly from individual to individual, but I know that if it's just below the nipple line a little bit, that it's maybe T5 or T6. Now, fortunately, from a learning standpoint, the muscle nerve roots are actually follow the same distributions. Those are called myotomes. So the motor portion of the peripheral nervous system, remember I will have my motor neurons that are on the upper portion in my brain that are coming from the opposite side of my frontal cortex, and they will cross down in the medulla at the pyramids and then go down the contralateral or opposite side and then exit. And so, for example, the muscles that will control the flexion and extension of my middle finger are going to be associated with the C7 nerve root. And although I'm not flexing or extending my nipple, but the pectoralis muscles that are there are on the upper portion thoracic. And it gives you an idea of where those nerves are, those nerve roots are. So as I mentioned to you, I have in my peripheral nervous system sensory as well as motor. You know that the signals either that ascend or descend will have a crossing point. And so that if I look at the upper motor neurons or the neurons in the cortex, those neurons are going to be on the opposite side of what's affected on a limb. Now they do coordinate, and this does not involve the brain, and that is through a reflex mechanism called the spinal cord reflex. And this is important for our survival, for example, because it may take a little bit too long to think about something and then make a course of action. So if I have some sort of a stimulus, it could be, for example, myotactic reflex, where I will stretch a tendon, such as my patellar tendon. It could be a noxious stimuli from stepping on a tack or in some way having some sort of heat or noxious stimuli applied to some portion of my body. But what will happen is that you see in this case that that sensory neuron will send a signal back, this is the red one, through the dorsal root ganglion going back to the spinal cord, and then it will synapse with neurons. Now the neurons that it will synapse will, some of them will cross the spinal cord and ascend and go up to the parietal lobe so that I understand what's going on, that I've had a noxious stimulus or a reflex. But I will also have two other synapses. One of them will go to an inhibitory interneuron that will tend to make it so that in this case where I've stretched the patellar tendon, I'll tend to oppose that. And then the other will also go to the original muscle that was affected by that stretch so that I can dampen that and I don't keep jerking my knee back and forth. So I will typically, in a spinal cord reflex, want to withdraw from a noxious stimulus or to prevent the contraction repeatedly from occurring if it's like a stretch reflex from, let's say, striking the patellar tendon. Now the last section of the peripheral nervous system is the autonomic nervous system. And I've mentioned this many times throughout lectures. This is branched into two parts, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems have both anatomical as well as functional differences. And so I'm going to talk about those. Now, in both cases, I'm involving my central nervous system in addition to this peripheral nervous system, this autonomic nervous system. But in the sympathetic nervous system, when the neurons exit the spinal cord, they synapse with neurons in what's called the sympathetic chain. And this is a set of ganglia which are physically located inside the body. And this is different from the parasympathetic, where they'll synapse with neurons in a ganglia that is very close in most cases to the target organ. For example, towards the eyes, it will synapse with, let's say, tear duct. And so it's different. It's not a chain. And I'll show you that in just a minute. The sympathetic nervous system is the fight or flight responses. So it's functionally different from the parasympathetic, which is a relaxation and rest response. So for example, in the sympathetic nervous system, I want to dilate my pupils. I want my heart rate to increase. I'm going to dilate bronchi. I'm going to release adrenaline or epinephrine or norepinephrine. I want to get as much glucose in my blood as I need. Don't worry about things like peeing or pooing or having any kind of digestive process going on, because if I don't escape from whatever imminent danger I have or I'm faced with, I'm not going to survive, and it doesn't matter. So these fight or flight responses are part of the sympathetic nervous system. On the other hand, the autonomic responses for the parasympathetic nervous system are to things like constrict my pupils, to decrease my heart rate. I don't need my bronchial tubes to have greater flow because I'm breathing, I'm not running away from anything. I can now digest food, so I can peristalse, I can go to the bathroom. And so all of these are done under conditions where I'm relaxed. They will also, both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system, will play a part in the sexual response, which I'll talk about in a bit when we talk about the endocrine reproductive system. And this is a pictorial representation of this, and you can see in the red portions that the neurons coming off the spinal cord are synapsing with neural cell bodies in this sympathetic ganglia. And those are these, and they're literally, when you are in medical school and you're dissecting a cadaver, you will see this sympathetic chain. And they will synapse and go out to various portions of the body. The one thing that I will note here is that the sympathetic nervous system will go to the adrenal medulla and allow for release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. There is no parasympathetic innervation of the medulla, and that's because epinephrine and norepinephrine are neurotransmitters that are only involved in the sympathetic nervous system. Now, the parasympathetic nervous system will send off neurons from the spinal cord and will then go to ganglia that are close to the end organ. So I mentioned before that you would have, let's say, a ciliary response, or you could have things that are splanchnic, which would basically then be for your lacrimal glands, or also for your parasympathetic control of your gastrointestinal system. Now, I use the neurotransmitter acetylcholine in both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system, but only norepinephrine and epinephrine, but norepinephrine and dopamine are used in the sympathetic nervous system. And that has important implications. For example, one of the things that people, a drug that is abused is cocaine, and cocaine is a drug that will inhibit the reuptake of norepinephrine at this synapse and will lead to constant sympathetic stimulation as a result of that. So again, this is kind of a pictorial representation of the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system that shows the sympathetic chain and then gives you very specific things that is going on with each of the organ systems in both the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. What I hope I've shown you in talking about neurology is this wonderful control system that involves both the central and peripheral part that work in tandem. It's a hardwired system that allows for you to have exquisite control of individual parts. I hope that this makes sense to you. I will come back and we'll do another video on various applications of this to help test your knowledge of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous systems. And as always, if you enjoy Science of Medicine and you enjoy these lectures, please feel free to like and subscribe to the channel. I'll see you soon. Thank you very much.